Hi class, this is the final lecture of Unit 2, and this is going to be all about the aftermath of the War of Independence. And this is going to be, in a sense, part 2 of the American Revolution. Think back to Thomas Paine's Common Sense and how his pamphlet really was a two-parter. Part 1 was about the reasons why independence should occur, and he said it was common sense to declare independence because of reasons like natural rights being violated, the compact theory being violated. But if you remember, there was a second part to his common sense, and that was the idea of what government should replace the English government, and he argued for a republic. So this lecture is going to largely talk about the ideals that were sparked by the American Revolution, and it's also going to talk about how the United States struggles, and let me emphasize struggles, to create this republic that people like Thomas Paine had advocated for. So what ends up happening is almost as soon as the Declaration of Independence is signed and the war becomes more official, the United States is going to create its first government, and this government is going to be known as the Articles of Confederation. Think of the Articles of Confederation as our first attempt at a constitution to provide a new American government. And it's not going to go over very well. It's only going to last for about a decade. The country is on the verge of falling apart by the time we get to the end of this lecture, and the Articles of Confederation are going to need some serious revision, if not replacement. Let me say one other thing before I go forward, as you do your essential idea, is let's remember that this war, even though it kind of started because of things like a proclamation of 1763 or unpopular taxes in Boston, it really becomes much more of a war about ideas and ideals about a government, the idea of natural rights, the idea of the rights of Englishmen, uh, the idea of compact theory, and that I talked about before. And then there's also this idea that a government should, reflect the needs of the people. A republic would be much more suitable. It would reflect more local government instead of government from a arbitrary monarch, from a king. Uh, so keep in mind that again, the American Revolution, regardless of its causes, ends up being much more of a war about ideas, about what the rights of people are, how a government should represent them, rights, the idea of freedom and equality. Those are the ideas that come out of the American Revolution. Remember that the most famous line from the Declaration of Independence of all is the idea of all men being created equal. So again, the war ends up being much more of a war of ideas by its end and in its aftermath. And then again, the government that is created afterwards is going to be pretty weak. The Articles of Confederation are going to prove to be inadequate. We'll get more into that later on. So first, let's talk about how the war impacted the United States, the brand new United States of America. And one thing, again, is that it created lots of ideals of equality. Remember, you had in the Declaration of Independence the phrase, all men are created equal. There was this idea of more freedom. In other words, this idea that a king and a parliament from across the ocean can't pass laws without local consent, without local government consent. And so there's a lot of ideas of freedom, a lot of ideas of equality that come out of the war. But the real question becomes, who does this equality go to? When Jefferson says, whenever he says all men are created equal, is he including women? Is he including non-whites? Is he including people that don't have much property? And of course, Jefferson was wealthy, had lots of property, and was white, and was male. So there are lots of questions about who this equality, who this freedom was really supposed to go to. And there are some sort of unintended consequences probably for Jefferson, because there are going to be a lot of people that are going to start to stand up and say, we deserve this equality, we deserve this freedom, we deserve a government that respects our natural rights as well. So here I'll talk about how these ideals are going to be limited for women and for blacks and for the loyalists that had stayed loyal to Britain throughout the war. I won't say a whole lot about the loyalists. but I will mention what happens to them. They basically leave. But with women and blacks, I'm going to talk a little bit more thoroughly about. So, one thing to note is that women did play a role in the American Revolutionary War, a vital role. When the men went off to fight, someone had to maintain the economy of the colonies or the United States. Someone had to maintain the businesses and the farms, and that would be the women. If women were not at home uh, taking care of the businesses that the men had left to go fight, then the economy would have crumbled. Women oftentimes provided some of the vital materials needed to fight the war. Women might be helping melt down metal for bullets. They might be helping weave or create uniforms of some sort or clothing for the soldiers to use. Uh, and again, if women weren't taking care of the, if you will, home front, then the men who were off fighting would have little support. The war could not have been won without women. A few women even disguised themselves as men because women were not allowed to fight. But some women did disguise themselves as men and fought as well. I've even heard of some that were extremely tough that would get shot in the leg and they would dig a bullet out of their leg and keep on fighting. So the women did fight sometimes. This was the exception rather than the rule. But again, women did play a role in the war, a vital role in the war, by basically taking care of the businesses and the farms that the men had typically maintained while the men were off fighting. Now, what's interesting is that as a result of this, when they take on these roles of basically maintaining the homes while the men were gone, women felt more empowered, and some of them felt like they deserved more equality. They believed that whenever the phrase all men are created equal came out, that it should also apply to women. And the best example of this is going to be uh, related to the woman you see in the picture here. So, John Adams, future president, remember he, during the Second Continental Congress, pushed more aggressively for declaring independence than anyone else. He also was one of the people, along with Ben Franklin and a couple of others, that helped Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. So, John Adams, in a sense, was also responsible for the phrase all men are created equal becoming part of the Declaration of Independence. Well, he had a very strong and very intelligent wife, pictured on the left, named Abigail. And Abigail Adams is going to call out John Adams for being a hypocrite. While she was maintaining the farm that the Adams had in outside of Boston, Massachusetts. She was doing that while John Adams was in Philadelphia signing the Declaration of Independence. She's going to call him out and say, hey, you're talking about this idea of all men being created equal and this idea of equality and this idea that if a government does not protect people's equality or their natural rights, then that government is no longer legitimate. And so what she says to John Adams is whenever you create a new government after this revolution, please, quote, remember the ladies. In other words, she is going to tell her husband that if he truly believes in natural rights and he truly believes that a government should protect people's natural rights, then those natural rights apply to women as well. Now, there is no official women's rights movement at this point, but you can see kind of the rumblings of women starting to say, hey, what about us? What about our natural rights? Natural rights don't just belong to men. Compact theory doesn't just apply to men. Equality doesn't just apply to men. And Abigail Adams is kind of one of those early voices that pushes for women's equality. And of course, she is the wife of the future president, John Adams. So she does have a lot of power in what she says. She's a very prominent woman in American history. And by the end of this class, we will talk about an official beginning of a women's rights movement that's going to carry on through the end of the course and on into American history too. Now on to American blacks. So before the war, a lot of people don't realize this, but slavery did exist in all 13 of the colonies. However, it was a lot less frequent, a lot less widespread in the northern colonies, and the northern colonies were less dependent on slavery. They didn't have these multi-hundred acre plantations like you might have seen in the southern colonies, so they weren't as addicted to slavery. And a lot of people after the American Revolution felt like the phrase all men created equal made maintaining slaves a hypocritical thing to do. So a lot of Americans, unlike they did with women, they did feel like this phrase all men are created equal might apply also to slaves. And so a lot of people in the northern states are going to get rid of slavery. And if you look at the map, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the map, but basically what this map shows is slavery before the American Revolution, and then slavery as it got phased out in the years after the Revolution, and slavery as it stood going forward into time. And as you'll see, it is either going to end immediately in some northern states or be phased out over time. But by the time of the American Civil War, slavery is gone in the North. And for a lot of people, slavery was eliminated because of this idea that maybe blacks should also have equal rights. Now, what's interesting is that even though slavery does get eliminated in all the northern states, there will still be discrimination. Black Americans in some northern states won't be allowed to vote. They won't be allowed to hold certain jobs. They might not be able to marry uh, uh, people that aren't also black. They won't be allowed to marry white. So is going to be some discrimination, but you will see at least a higher degree of freedom and equality for blacks in the northern states, largely because of the ideals of the American Revolution. However, as most people well know, slavery is going to continue in the southern states, and in fact, it's going to end up growing after the invention of the cotton gin, which I'll get to at a later point. So, slavery will continue in the southern states. It will become a vital part of the economy. The southern economy could not survive without slavery, and as the decades go forward and as people in the North become gradually more anti slavery and the people in the South become more defensive of slavery, you can tell this is going to become a major issue of division in the nation and will lead to ultimately the kind of the climax of American History 1, which is the American Civil War. So you already again see the seeds of the Civil War being planted here. The North is getting rid of slavery, the South is digging in their heels and becoming more addicted to slavery. So you're basically going to have almost like two countries coexisting under one government, a northern set of states and a southern set of states. And that uh, tension or sectionalism, that's a term we'll talk about more later, will increase over time. Now, real quickly, let's go through what happens to the Loyalists. Basically, the Loyalists are going to be discriminated against. They're going to be seen as un-American. They're going to be seen as being on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of the war. Part of the Treaty of Paris that Ben Franklin had helped get signed had said that the Loyalists would get their land that had been taken away by the Patriots. They'd get their land back. Well, that didn't really happen, and Loyalists are going to be discriminated against. They are going to be unpopular, so they decide largely to leave, and that's known as the Loyalist Exodus. So around 100,000 people that were left that were still loyal to Britain are going to leave the country to escape this discrimination. And it would be a long trip to go all the way back to Britain. So what a lot of them end up doing is they just go north of the border into Canada, which at the time was still owned by Britain. So that's what happens to the Loyalists. And so you end up having a lot of Loyalists who got harassed. You see here this picture, a Loyalist being harassed. They largely leaving a population mostly of people that were now happy to be independent from Britain and happy to have a separate country, the United States of America. Okay, so let's go on to the next chart, and you need to listen carefully because you'll lose credit if you don't fill out this entire chart correctly. From time to time, you are going to see charts that have it's like a box or an oval or a circle in the middle. And that circle or oval or box in the middle is going to be the theme of the chart that it is in the middle of. So what you need to write in the middle oval of this next box is new political ideas. Again, in the middle oval, write new political ideas. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of new political ideas that rise up out of the American Revolution. Number 1 is probably the most important, and that is that the United States is going to create a republic, which is something Thomas Paine has suggested. And remember that in a republic, the idea of a republic is that the power comes from the people. The power of government comes from the people, which goes right along with compact theory. But how is that power given? Through elections. So people vote for people to represent them in government. And if the people in government do what the rest of the Americans want, then they will stay in power and continue to do a good job. If they do not do a good job or abuse their power, then the American people will vote them out. And that maintains compact theory, that maintains a respect of people's natural rights. Uh, and again, this was something that Thomas Paine had talked about. Now, the question going forward is who gets to vote? And the people that vote are the ones that get their natural rights and compact theory respected. If blacks can't vote, then you're not going to see the government respect the rights of blacks. If women can't vote, you're not going to see the government respect the rights of women as much. But again, more on those ideas later. Right now, just note that the United States does, even though it's very limited because of who's allowed to vote, it does create a republic where power comes from the people ultimately through elections. A second thing, and you'll go to the upper right of this chart now, is that a lot of governments start to kind of follow the lead of what the old Connecticut colony had done, and they start to write down constitutions. They start to write down plans of government that were usually a republic of some sort. These constitutions would include multiple branches of government, a legislative, executive, a judicial branch, which you've heard of before if you've taken a civics class. And they also included lists of the rights of the citizens, things, maybe like freedom of the press, or things like freedom of speech, or maybe the right to bear arms, or the right not to be searched without a warrant. It really depended on what state you were in. Now, the reason I'm mentioning number 2 is because eventually the United States is going to replace the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution we have today, and a lot of the Constitution that we have today is based off of what these states put in their state constitutions before. And every state today does have its own constitution. One final thing that happens, a new political idea, is this idea of separating religion from government. And that largely starts thanks to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, again, was from Virginia. During the Revolution, or sometime right after the Declaration of Independence, he is going to help create the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was the first law that officially separated all churches from the state government, allowing complete religious freedom. So this is the first state to do it. And that becomes an integral part of the United States Constitution later on. Part of the First Amendment is allowing for freedom of religion. And Thomas Jefferson basically was saying that if the church and the state governments, or if the churches and governments in general are linked in any way, then one's going to corrupt the other, or they'll corrupt each other. You'll have basically laws that are passed that reflect only certain people's religious beliefs. It'll empower one church over other churches, and then, of course, it could lead to government corruption of the churches as well. So, for various reasons, a lot of those you see in world history, Thomas Jefferson is going to say, let's separate government from religion, and not outlaw religion, but just keep the two separate. And he also probably could look at what had happened in Europe and how there have been wars over religion in Europe that we've talked about in the first unit, and said, let's try not to have that happen here. Okay, so those are some of the new political ideas coming out of the American Revolution. Now let's get into our first try to create a republic, and that will be under the Articles of Confederation. So in the first year of the official American Revolution, in other words, within a year of declaring independence, the Articles of Confederation are going to be created. And they are significant because they were the first written plan of government for the United States. In other words, they were our first attempt at a constitution. Now, many of you have written papers before, and you've written a first draft, and it wasn't very good, so you had to go back and change it, or sometimes you had to completely rewrite the whole thing before turning it in for a grade. And that's kind of what happens with the Articles of Confederation. This is a first draft almost. We go with it, and it fails pretty miserably overall, and so we end up replacing it. So, real quickly, I'll go through how the government was structured under the Articles of Confederation. And the thing that you need to think about the whole time is that this is a very weak government. So, for example, there's only one branch of government, the legislative branch. And if you know your civics, you know that the legislative branch of government is responsible for passing laws. It's not responsible for enforcing laws, which you can already see a problem there. It's not responsible for deciding if the laws are in line with the Constitution, and that could be a problem as well. You could have some very unjust laws getting passed. So there's only going to be one branch of government, the legislative branch, which creates laws that it then cannot enforce. On top of that, it's going to have a hard time passing laws to begin with. So you're going to have one branch of government just to Congress, the legislative branch, and the Congress is going to give every state one representative. If your state has 1 million people in it, you get one representative. If your state has one person in it, it gets one representative. And that's going to be seen as unfair to a lot of people because the states aren't being represented proportionally. Small states and big states have the same amount of power. Small states like that, big states not so much. So you have 13 people in Congress, one for each state. And there is no, if they pass a law, and I'll get into why they have trouble passing laws later, if they pass a law, there's no executive branch to enforce it. In other words, there's no president to enforce the laws. There is no executive branch government agencies to enforce the laws. Basically, they'll make a law and then hope that people will follow them. And the one law that they're going to struggle with the most is the idea of enforcing taxes. I'll get more into that later on. In fact, they can't pass taxes. More on that later. There's no judicial branch. There's no Supreme Court to interpret whether or not a law should even be on the books. So there is a potential, if they could pass a law, for them to pass a law that doesn't even follow the Articles of Confederation. Next is how difficult it is to pass laws. So laws are very difficult to pass. It takes 9 out of 13 members of Congress, in other words, 9 out of 13 states, to agree to pass a law. And 9 out of 13 is pretty much 3/4. And if you look at Congress today, it's hard to get half of Congress to agree on something today, much less 3/4. So laws are pretty much impossible to pass. It's very hard to get 9 out of 13 states to agree on a law, especially because the different states had their different needs. I talked about how the northern states, how they had not an agricultural base, and talked about how they didn't need slavery, but the southern states are agriculturally based and they do need slavery, or they feel like they need slavery. So it's going to be very hard for anyone to be on the same page. Amendments are even harder to pass. They are impossible to pass. You have to have 13 out of 13 states agree. And it's very rare that Congress unanimously agrees on anything. Even whenever the United States was bombed in Pearl Harbor in 1941, the vote to go to war in World War II was not a unanimous vote. So it's pretty much impossible to pass laws, very much impossible to pass amendments. So, long story short, the federal government, the central government that was supposed to unite all the colonies under one government, was extremely weak. And almost all the power went to the states. And that's something to keep in mind, is that, remember, a federal government is the central government. They unite smaller governments. And at this point, it is very weak, and the states have almost all the power. And you'll see this kind of conflict between federal government power and state government power. That's going to be something that continues on throughout American history, even really honestly till today. You'll see it become a big deal whenever the Civil War comes along, whenever the southern states want to maintain the right to own slaves, and they feel like the federal government is about to take that away from them. Let's remember again the name of this new Constitution. It is the Articles of Confederacy. Or Articles of Confederation. They have formed a confederacy, and I talked before about what a confederacy was. A confederacy is a government where the central government is very weak and the local governments are very strong. And at this point, they've gone too far in the direction of making the states very powerful and the federal government virtually worthless. So why did they create such a weak federal government? Many Americans were very opposed to the idea of having a very strong federal government. Here you see the two Georges. You see King George III on the left, and you see George Washington on the right. A lot of Americans had a very bad taste in their mouths based on the governing of King George III. They said that if we give a federal government strong power, then it's going to become oppressive. It's going to lead to the rise of another king, just like King George III. So basically, whenever King George III had been too heavy handed in the eyes of the colonists, now the members of the United States are wanting to go extreme in the other direction. They don't want to have a government that's too powerful, so they are intentionally creating a government that is too weak, a government that maximizes freedom as much as possible. But as you might already realize, there is a such thing as having too little structure, too little rules, too little government. Imagine a classroom where the teacher basically says, okay, I've got these rules, there's not very many of them, and even the few that I have, I'm not going to enforce them. That classroom's going to fall apart pretty quickly. People aren't going to do what they're supposed to do. People aren't going to learn in that classroom. So basically, the United States had formed a government at this point that was too weak to pass laws, much less enforce them. And that's going to cause the country to fall apart, almost to fall into anarchy. It was at risk of falling into anarchy, and I will get into that more in a little bit. But I will tell you about a couple of successes that occur under the Articles of Confederation, and then I'll go big time talking about the weaknesses. So one strength. Now we're on the back of the lecture notes, and we're going to go horizontally. So we'll do the first row first. So the first strength that you see under the Articles of Confederation is that they do have the power to declare war, and we do have a war against Britain. They do have the power to raise an army. Now, paying for that army is something else, but they can create an army, and they did. They created the Continental Army. And with the help of France, under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was able to win the American Revolutionary War, and it was able to become independent. And that's a pretty big success under the Articles of Confederation. Now, had another country come along 10 years later and tried to declare war again on us, I don't know that the Articles of Confederation could have pulled this off a second time. Again, I told you that France played a very strong role in us winning the war. We're not going to always be able to count on French help. The other thing, and this is going to be a big deal, is that the Articles of Confederation were given control over all of the land that had been given to the United States in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that wasn't already a state. So all the land basically from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River that the United States owned, the Congress was given authority to decide what to do with it. And what they will do is they will pass a law. It's one of the few laws they successfully pass, but they do pass a law known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what this does is it sets two major precedents. Number one is it sets up a system for turning territory into states. And so basically what happens is that when an area gets a certain number of people in it, it can become a territory and get protection from the United States and have limited rights in our government. And then when it gets a bigger population, it can submit a constitution to become a new state. And this is very important because it kind of sets the tone for what happens with later states. The question could have, what could have happened was the 13 original states could have basically dominated any future states and almost treated them the way that King George III had treated the original colonies. But what this does is it allows for states to come in, and once a state comes in, it has the exact same rights as every other state. It does not matter if you are Hawaii, which is our newest state, or if you are one of the original 13. Every state automatically has the same rights as all the others. And so what the Northwest Ordinance did is it set up a system for creating new states that, so far as I know, is still used today. And once a territory becomes a state, it has the same rights as every other state. There are no states that are above others in terms of their rights in the federal government. Here's the other big precedent set by the Northwest Ordinance, and that is that it bans slavery. So the federal government is going to look at the Northwest Territory and they are going to ban slavery. I don't know how they got the southern states to agree to this. Well, actually, I do have an idea. I believe there was a Southwest ordinance that was also created that created some southern states or potential southern states in what would now be maybe Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. Uh, but that's not really the focus of this lecture. Uh, Back to the point. Northwest Territory is going to have slavery banned. And this means that there is a new source of tension or an emerging source of tension, and that is that as the country expands out west, some of the states that come into the United States will be free, some of the states that come in will be slave. And here with the Northwest Territory, you see a lot of potential free states coming in. And that's going to create tension. This is planting the seeds for civil war because every time that the country obtains new territory, for example, the Louisiana Purchase, later on we'll get a lot of land from Mexico in the Mexican Cession. Whenever the United States gets new land, there's going to be tension over whether or not this new land that we've obtained from out west will be free or slave, or if it'll be divided up between some slave states and some free states. The role of slavery or the expansion of slavery into the West as we grow as a nation going forward will be the major contributor to the coming of the Civil War. So every time we get new land, there's going to be tension over whether or not it's going to be free or slave. And from time to time, we come up with compromises that kind of kick the Civil War can down the road, but eventually you will see that tension reach a breaking point. So keep in mind, you might want to star and highlight that last bullet there. Slavery's role in westward expansion will contribute heavily to the coming of the Civil War. Slavery is the core cause, if you will, and slavery in the West will be a major cause of the Civil War. Now let's get into the weaknesses. And you can see from this chart here, I've got several examples of weaknesses. And if you look at the arrows, they all feed into, ultimately, the revision of the Articles of Confederation. I'll talk about the three main weaknesses and then Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion will be the sort of breaking point. Okay, so the first weakness, which I've already mentioned, is that they have a weak federal government. One word to associate with the Articles of Confederation, the one word, if you want to just think of a simple way to remember it, is the word weak. The Articles of Confederation are weak. They did not earn the respect of the United States. In fact, whenever we had the 13 original states at the very beginning, the other countries, when they sent diplomats over to the United States, they wondered if they should send one or send 13. They didn't know if they should address the states individually, if they should address the federal government, because the federal government was so weak. And they also knew that because the federal government was weak, that they could probably get away with harassing us some. So remember those forts that I kept talking about in the last lecture and in previous lectures, the forts that are in this area that I'm pointing out with the mouse. Well, Britain is going to maintain these forts, like Fort Detroit. And they are going to maintain the forts in this area, and they are going to harass us. They are going to hand off weapons to Native Americans to take and use against settlers that are crossing the Appalachians into the Ohio River Valley. So that will continue to be an issue. The federal government doesn't like this, but it's too weak to do much about it. Now, if you did cross the Appalachian Mountains, you really, really, really needed access to this body of water right here that I'm pointing out, the Mississippi River. If you're on this side of the Appalachian Mountains, on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and you want to do any trading with any other countries, you have to be able to get your goods onto the Mississippi River, because from the Mississippi River, you can go down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then from the Gulf of Mexico, you can go and trade wherever you want. The problem is that there is a neighbor on the other side of the Mississippi River, and that would be Spain. And so the United States and Spain disputed who actually had control of the Mississippi River. Spain was a much stronger country than the United States was. I told you that we had a weak government. Spain does not have as weak of government. And so they can also kind of harass us along the Mississippi River. There was also a section in the southwestern portion of the United States right here that both Spain and the United States were kind of fighting over, and Spain had the upper hand because they had a stronger government. And again, when Britain harassed us, when Spain harassed us, when they were trying to push us around, Congress was too weak to do anything about it. And so basically, a lot of the rest of the world was looking at the United States as this experiment that was about to fail. And again, uh, Congress was too weak to really do anything about this. And it's sad to say, but basically, these big countries could bully us because they knew that we were too weak to stand up for ourselves. That won't always be the case, but it was at this point. Now, one of the biggest weaknesses, if not the biggest weakness, associated with this federal government is that it could not. Well, I got ahead of myself. Excuse me. I was going to talk about taxing. I'll talk about taxing in a second. One other problem is that it could not regulate our economy very well. It couldn't print money. If you lived in North Carolina, you use North Carolina dollars. If you lived in Virginia, you use Virginia dollars. Anytime you crossed the border between states, you had to exchange money. Oftentimes, states would charge each other to trade with each other. So states had to print their own money. There was no federal government money like there is now. Today, it doesn't matter what state you're in, American dollars are all worth the same no matter what state you go to. Back then, each state had their own money. And states did not cooperate. They would tax each other. For example, if North Carolina was producing tobacco and Virginia was producing tobacco, let's say Virginia tobacco farmers wanted to send and sell some tobacco into North Carolina, well, North Carolina would put a big tax or a big toll on it before it could be traded in North Carolina. So there was no unified trade amongst the states. You see it kind of shown here in this cartoon. And the states were really not cooperating with each other, so they were divided. They taxed each other's trade. They competed with one another, and so that's going to be very damaging to the economy. It's going to damage the national economy, and it's going to damage union between the states. The states are going to start competing with each other economically because you don't have really this idea of a national economy. You have each state doing its own thing. And each state was also competing with each other when it came to trading with other countries. Virginia and North Carolina might each compete with getting the best trade with France, for example. And so, again, the states are not cooperating. It's bad for the economy as a whole. It's bad for unity. And the United States needed to be more united. At this point, the United States was much more, if you were to take the phrase United States, the emphasis would have been on states, not on being united. And it's going to be that way for a long time, but it's especially that way under the Articles of Confederation. Now, finally, the biggest weakness, in my opinion, and that's going to be the fact that Congress had no power to tax. And that's a big issue because the American Revolution had been very expensive. And there were a lot of war debts that needed to be paid. The United States owed a lot of money to countries like France for helping out. A lot of people had bought what were called war bonds. They had basically given loans to the Congress of money to help finance the war. And now that the war was over, the American people wanted to have their war bonds paid back with interest. They wanted their loans to be paid back, and the federal government just didn't have the money to pay it because they had no way to collect money. They had no power to tax. Why did they not have any power to tax? Well, because people had gotten unhappy with King George III's taxes and had probably overreacted it to the other extreme and now given the government no power to tax. So what does the federal government do for money, for taxes? Well, they basically ask the states to give some of their taxes. You see here Uncle Sam pretty much begging the states to give some of their tax money so that the United States can pay for things, and a lot of states would say no. Only a quarter of states would even give any money to the federal government, so the federal government had practically no money. That's a big problem because they can't pay back war debts. They also, if they have an army, they can't afford to pay their soldiers. And we've already talked about how George Washington's leadership is what kept the soldiers signing their one-year contracts. It was not the fact that the soldiers were well paid. So that's going to create a problem because if there's any other war that comes along, the Congress can create an army and then it won't be able to pay for its soldiers. It won't be able to enforce a draft of soldiers, and we're going to get taken over by another country. So the Congress had to have money, and it just didn't. One of the other problems is what happens if there's a rebellion in one of the states? What happens if the people in the state pull a Bacon's Rebellion? Is there going to be any military that can stop this rebellion, or will the rebellion cause the state to fall apart? If there's multiple rebellions, well, the whole country fall apart. And again, if you can't pay for an army, you can't stop rebellions, you can't keep law and order, the country is going to fail. So, what did the states do if they needed something? Well, uh, the states could pay for stuff, but not the federal government. Another big thing is that the federal government could not build anything in terms of infrastructure. And infrastructure means any kind of transportation systems, any kind of roads or bridges or tunnels or eventually canals. They can't afford to build any of these things uh, because they can't pay for them. Now, imagine today if the federal government could no longer pay for the interstate highway system and the interstates went away. Imagine what would happen to trade in our country. It would grind to almost a halt. You'd have your tractor trailers that usually haul products on the interstates. They'd be using back roads. They'd be getting to their destinations much slower. They'd be creating traffic jams. So you have to have infrastructure. You have to have transportation systems in order to help trade happen in this country. If you don't have infrastructure, you don't have trade. And if people can't buy and sell stuff, then everyone goes broke. The economy fails. The country falls apart. So there's multiple reasons why this lack of a power to tax is a big problem under the Articles of Confederation. Now, that being said, the states could tax. They gave themselves power to tax in their state constitutions, and oftentimes they went overboard with these high taxes, or the people in the cities of these states would pass taxes that only applied to the people outside the cities of these states. And that's going to be what happens with Shays' Rebellion. So the states are oftentimes going to try to take care of all of these problems by themselves. And as you can predict, a state can't take care of a problem usually as widespread as, say, the federal government can. Like a state can raise an army, but it can't raise an army as big as 13 states can. It can't raise a federal army. Anyway, so states are going to oftentimes pass taxes themselves. And that's going to lead ultimately to Shays' Rebellion. So this is very interesting that it happens in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, which was dominated by people living in the cities like Boston or Lexington and Concord, but especially Boston, they're going to pass taxes to help pay off their debts. Obviously, Massachusetts had accumulated a lot of debt during the war because a lot of the early fighting had happened, like Bunker Hill in Massachusetts. So what ends up happening is that you have the people that are in the city of Boston, they pass a tax, and they're not going to pass a tax on themselves. They're going to pass a tax on the farmers in the western part of the state. And it's going to hurt these farmers so much that a lot of them start to lose their homes. Now, this to me is an extremely interesting piece of hypocrisy because the western farmers didn't have much say in the legislature in Boston, yet they were getting taxed. So, and of all places, Massachusetts, you have people now feeling like they are being taxed without representation. So, the people that were involved in Shays' Rebellion could rightly say almost no taxation without representation. The people of Boston are passing a tax on us, the poor farmers, and these taxes are so high that we can't afford to pay them. We're losing our farms. So Shays' Rebellion happens. What you see here is you see a tax collector getting attacked. You did see tarring and feathering occur again. You did see tax collectors occurring again. It's like the American Revolution all over again. It's happening in Massachusetts, of all places. So farmers want to lower the taxes. They want to get rid of the foreclosure of their farms. They want to be able to keep their farms. If someone was arrested for attacking a tax collector, or if someone was about to lose their farm, or they're going to be put in prison for not paying back debts or paying their taxes, the farmers would rise up to the courts and they would attack the courtrooms and free the farmers that they felt were being treated unfairly. Again, this is all known as Shays' Rebellion, led by a man named Daniel Shays. And this rebellion is going to be the big wake-up call for the Congress regarding the Articles of Confederation. So Daniel Shays is going to lead over 1,000 farmers. They're going to go to a federal arsenal, or they're going to try to go to a federal arsenal to steal government weapons, and then they're going to try to march on Boston itself. This should remind you of Bacon's Rebellion, because again, it was the lower classes rising up against the wealthier classes that were abusing them. This should remind you somewhat of the American Revolution, because the issue at hand was basically taxation without representation. And it's almost as if now Boston is playing the role of King George III, and the poor farmers in western Massachusetts are like the American colonists. So Daniel Shays is going to lead this rebellion, and luckily for Massachusetts government, they are able to use their state militia to stop the rebellion. However, the message has been sent, the message has been heard loud and clear from Congress that the Articles of Confederation just aren't cutting it. There has been a major rebellion that has taken place in Massachusetts. It was luckily put down, luckily from the point of view of the Boston legislature, luckily from the point of view of the Articles of Confederation, the Congress there. But what happens if these rebellions happen in other states? What happens if all the states start seeing the people rise up against their governments, and they all start to attack their governments, and you have 13 new American revolutions going on all at the same time? The country was at the brink of falling into anarchy. And if that were to have happened, I can almost guarantee you that King George III would have sent British troops right back in and said, "Here I am to give you law and order again. Welcome back to the British Empire." And then independence would have been lost. So we had to maintain law and order. If we couldn't, we would be weak, and we could be easily taken over by another country, probably Britain, who was still bitter about losing us. So Shays' Rebellion, more than anything else, exposed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And so Shays' Rebellion is going to show that there could be rebellions in other parts of the country, and that, of course, could cause the country to fall apart, like I was saying earlier. And Congress knew that even if they raised an army, they'd have to get these soldiers from states, and the states by this point weren't too willing to cooperate with Congress. Even if they could raise the army, they knew that they couldn't pay for this army, so they might get a soldier for a few months, and the soldier is eventually going to say, well, if I'm not getting paid, I'm going home. So, again, the country was at risk of falling apart because of the threat of rebellions, and Congress could not raise an army, or if it couldn't pay for one to keep an army. So it doesn't matter if you can raise an army if you can't pay to keep it. And so they needed to revise the articles. And they also looked at what the causes of these rebellions were, and the causes of these rebellions were largely because of the financial problems that were caused by the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Congress could not keep the economy strong by building infrastructure because it couldn't raise taxes to create the infrastructure. It could not regulate the trade between the states, so the states kept fighting each other over trade. And of course, if it couldn't tax to provide necessary services, then the states would often provide their own taxes to their own states, and these states had proven that they treated some of their members better than others. So just like Virginia colony had treated some of its colonists better than others at the time of Bacon's Rebellion, you saw with Shays' Rebellion, you saw that the state of Massachusetts was treating the people of Boston better than it was the western farmers in the state, and the poor western farmers in the state, and you saw that tension creating rebellions. So Congress couldn't stop the financial problems that led to rebellions, and if a rebellion broke out, they could not raise and sustain financially an army to stop the rebellion. So the Congress is going to call out of retirement, you'll see here, George Washington. George Washington had retired after winning the American Revolution and gone back to his estate in Virginia. He gets called out of retirement to help lead a convention to basically revise the Articles of Confederation. So again, the Articles of Confederation had proven too weak, and they had to be revised. And so Congress is going to authorize what's known as the Philadelphia Convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Eventually, it's going to be called the Constitutional Convention because they go into this convention to revise the Articles. They come out with a brand new Constitution. By the way, notice who's sitting here. Look at this picture. You'll see Ben Franklin yet again. Ben Franklin was there when the colonies first considered uniting with the Albany Plan of Union. He was there whenever the Continental Congress decided to declare independence. During the war, he helped secure French help. At the end of the war, he helped sign the treaty to end the war. He had signed the Articles of Confederation, I believed, and then realized they were not any good. He's also going to be there when we replace the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. So Ben Franklin is noteworthy as an early founding father because he was basically there from the time the colonies considered uniting during the French and Indian War all the way till the creation of the United States Constitution that we live under even today. So notice what Congress says. Congress tells the convention to revise the articles, not replace them. But eventually, the Constitutional Convention does replace the Articles of Confederation with a new Constitution, the one that we have today. And then basically, it's going to invite states to join up under this new Constitution, and the Congress is powerless to stop them. And we have it's almost like a second revolution. So, in the end, basically, the replacement of the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution will be the final steps, the final chapters of the American Revolution. Remember, let's go back to the beginning of the lecture. Thomas Paine had said that we needed to get rid of the British government because they had violated natural rights and compact theory. That had happened already. And then he said we need to replace the British government with a new kind of government, a republic. And our first attempt at a republic was failing, and we're about to replace that weak republic with a strong one. That will be the subject of the first lecture of the next unit. At this point, I've wrapped up Unit 2. And again, Unit 2 overall was about the reasons why the American Revolution took place. Again, it started off with distaste for the policies of the British government. It becomes a revolution of ideas. We fight the war, we win the war with the help of the French, and then we try to replace the British government with one of our own. And at this point in this course, you'll see that we are not replacing it with a very effective government with the Articles of Confederation, but we're about to fix that. And you'll see that in Unit 3. You'll see the establishment of a strong government in Unit 3, and then how we progress as a nation under that new constitution, all the way up to a second war with Britain known as the War of 1812. So Unit 3 will cover the Constitution and the early years of the country up through the War of 1812. I hope you've enjoyed Unit 2.